In 1944, the German Air Force did not lose control of the skies because it lacked pilots, fuel, or aircraft. It lost control because of an assumption, a simple belief, drilled into doctrine, reinforced by experience, and proven right thousands of times before. A rookie pilot will panic when he is alone. The Luftwaffe built its interception tactics around that idea. They hunted stragglers. They isolated the weak. They waited for fear to do the killing. And almost always, it worked. But on one morning over Germany, that assumption failed. Not because the American pilot was more aggressive, not because his aircraft was unbeatable, not because he was lucky. It failed because he did not behave as expected. No panic, no retreat, no fatal mistake. What followed was not a heroic duel. It was a breakdown of timing, coordination, and radio discipline inside one of the most experienced fighter forces in the world. This is not the story of a teenage ace. It is the story of how wars are decided by invisible expectations and how a single pilot, doing nothing extraordinary, exposed a flaw no one believed could exist. What kind of deep, system-level history matters to you? Consider subscribing. This channel isn't about heroes, it's about how wars actually work. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had stopped being a contest of skill and become a contest of endurance. Every day, hundreds of Allied bombers crossed the Channel and pushed deeper into German airspace. Every day, they were met by flak, fighters, and a system designed to break them piece by piece. The German response was no longer improvised. It was industrial. Interception zones were mapped. Altitudes were calculated. Fuel consumption was optimized. Fighter groups were positioned not to win individual dogfights, but to exploit patterns. The Luftwaffe understood something fundamental about air combat. Aircraft did not fail first. People did. And people failed in predictable ways. Years of combat had taught German fighter commanders that isolation was fatal. A lone aircraft, separated from its formation, was not a threat, it was a target. Stragglers panicked. They made sharp turns. They bled speed. They fixated on one attacker and forgot the rest. Fear compressed their decision-making until only instinct remained, and instinct killed them. This belief was not arrogance, it was experience. German pilots had watched it happen again and again, over France, over Britain, over the Eastern Front. Green pilots, especially, reacted the same way when they realized they were alone. Some dove too steeply and lost control. Others climbed desperately until their engines choked. Many froze, hoping the problem would solve itself. Very few survived. By 1944, this expectation had hardened into doctrine. Lone fighters were not chased recklessly. They were herded, pressured, forced into bad geometry. German radio calls reflected this confidence. Calm instructions, short commands, minimal urgency. The system assumed that time was on its side. It almost always was. On the Allied side, this reality was understood just as clearly. American training manuals warned pilots never to fly alone over enemy territory, never to break formation, never to chase a target at the expense of mutual support. Survival depended on discipline, not heroics. But war rarely respects doctrine on both sides equally. The 8th Air Force was expanding faster than it could replace experience. Losses were mounting. Veteran pilots were being rotated out, captured, or killed. Training pipelines shortened. Flight hours were reduced. Young men arrived in England with the technical qualifications to fly modern fighters, but without the emotional conditioning of combat. They were competent. They were trained. They were also untested. Commanders knew the risk. They knew that every new pilot represented a statistical liability, not because they lacked skill, but because they had not yet learned how their minds would react under pressure. Combat revealed flaws that simulators could not. This is where the German assumption gained its power. It did not require superior aircraft. It did not require numerical advantage. It required only that human behavior remain consistent. When a lone fighter appeared on radar, the response was routine. A pair would engage, forcing evasive action. Others would position themselves to cut off escape routes. The target would react. The system would close. Radios would stay calm. The fight would end quickly. From the German perspective, this was not cruelty. it was efficiency. What no one on either side questioned was the assumption itself. It had been validated too many times. Entire interception strategies depended on it. Remove that assumption, and the logic began to fray. What if a lone pilot did not panic? What if he did not turn away at the first sign of danger? What if he did not fixate, or bleed energy, or make the predictable mistake? Doctrine had no answer for that scenario, because it had never needed one. On one morning in March 1944, high above the bomber stream and far inside hostile airspace, that untested assumption was about to be exposed not by a new aircraft or a new tactic, but by a pilot who refused to behave as the system expected. And when expectation fails in war, it is not confusion that follows first. It is silence. Isolation in the air was not dangerous because of numbers. It was dangerous because it stripped away margin. A fighter formation existed to absorb uncertainty. Wingmen watched blind spots. Radios distributed awareness. Energy states were shared, mistakes corrected before they became fatal. Alone, a pilot lost all of that at once. In combat training, isolation was treated as a theoretical failure. In real combat, it was treated as a terminal one. The physics were unforgiving. A single pilot had to manage altitude, speed, fuel, oxygen, engine temperatures, radio traffic, and situational awareness simultaneously. Every second spent checking one variable was a second not spent scanning the sky. Every evasive maneuver traded speed for survival, and speed was life. German doctrine exploited this relentlessly. Luftwaffe fighters did not rush isolated targets. They observed them. They waited for stress to do the work. A lone pilot, aware of his vulnerability, would begin to overcorrect. Sharp turns tightened vision. Tunnel focus set in. Decision cycles shortened. Fear compressed time. This was not theory. It was pattern recognition. Veteran German pilots had learned to read behavior the way hunters read tracks. A slight climb suggested indecision. A sudden dive suggested panic. An unnecessary turn revealed fixation. Each movement narrowed the possible outcomes until only one remained. The kill often came last. The mistake always came first. Allied planners knew this, which is why formation discipline was enforced with near religious seriousness. Pilots were drilled to resist temptation. Do not chase a damaged aircraft. Do not break altitude cover. Do not turn alone. These rules were not about aggression. They were about survival mathematics. But rules assumed stability. In early 1944, stability was breaking down. The pace of operations increased. Escort ranges extended deeper into Germany. Missions lasted longer. Mechanical failures became more frequent. Engines misfired, radios cut out, weather scattered formations. A single aborted flight leader could ripple into chaos across miles of sky. Every one of those disruptions created isolation. From the ground, it looked manageable. From the cockpit, it felt absolute. A lone pilot could not know how many enemies were nearby. Radar information arrived late or not at all. Radio calls overlapped or vanished in static. Visual contact became the only truth, and vision could be deceived by sun, cloud, and exhaustion. In those moments, experience mattered less than mental response. Most new pilots reacted by narrowing their world. They focused on the nearest threat. They fixated on escape vectors. They prioritized survival over mission without realizing the two were linked. Breaking away often exposed bombers. Staying close often meant facing danger alone. This conflict broke people. German interception tactics were built to exploit that fracture. Fighters attacked bombers not only to destroy them, but to draw escorts out of position. Once separated, the escorts became prey. The Luftwaffe did not need to defeat the entire formation. It only needed to peel off enough protection for flak and follow-on attacks to finish the job. Isolation was the hinge. For years, this dynamic held. Even as aircraft improved and tactics evolved, human reactions remained consistent. Stress produced predictable errors. Fear produced predictable motion. Doctrine became confident because reality reinforced it. Confidence hardened into certainty. By 1944, German radio discipline reflected that certainty. Calls were concise. Orders assumed compliance. Pilots trusted that isolated opponents would behave according to expectation. There was no urgency in their voices because urgency had rarely been required. On the Allied side, commanders accepted the cost. Losses were tragic but statistically tolerable. The system compensated by pushing more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel into the air. Attrition was brutal, but progress continued. No one designed contingency plans for a lone pilot who did not break. No one trained for an opponent who refused the expected sequence of fear, error, and collapse. Because in war, planning is built not on possibility, but on probability. And probability said that isolation always ended the same way. One pilot entered that empty space above the bomber stream and did something no one on either side was prepared to interpret correctly. The sky did not change. The aircraft did not change. The rules of physics did not change. But the assumption did. And when assumptions fail, systems hesitate. First failure did not occur in the air. It occurred in interpretation. At altitude, combat rarely announces itself with clarity. Aircraft appear as specks, glints of metal against sun and cloud. Speed is inferred, not measured. Intent is guessed, not confirmed. Pilots make decisions based on incomplete information and patterns learned through repetition. That morning, the pattern appeared familiar. German fighters climbing back after an attack on the bomber stream spotted a lone escort aircraft above them. No formation, no wingmen, no obvious support. From every angle that mattered, the picture aligned with expectation. An isolated pilot. This mattered more than numbers. A lone aircraft at altitude was assumed to be defensive. It would avoid engagement. It would preserve energy. It would wait for help or turn away. That assumption shaped the German response before the first maneuver was made. They did not scatter. They did not immediately climb to contest position. They did not treat the contact as an urgent threat. They continued to regroup. This was not hesitation. It was confidence. German fighter doctrine emphasized economy of motion. Energy was conserved for moments that mattered. An isolated escort did not matter, not yet. The real targets were the bombers below. The escort could be dealt with later, after it revealed its intentions. That was the mistake. The American pilot did not behave defensively. He did not descend. He did not turn away. He held altitude. To an experienced observer, that should have registered as abnormal. Most inexperienced pilots, when isolated, attempted to escape by diving toward lower altitudes or by drifting laterally in search of friendly aircraft. Holding position required discipline and a willingness to accept risk. But doctrine filtered perception. The Germans interpreted the lack of movement as indecision. They read patience as fear. They assumed delay meant hesitation. Every second that passed reinforced their expectation that the lone aircraft would eventually break away. Instead, it was waiting. Altitude is leverage. Speed is stored in height, converted when needed. By maintaining position above the German fighters, the American pilot preserved options they believed he would not use. This was not a tactical innovation. It was basic energy management. What made it dangerous was that it contradicted behavioral expectation. When the dive came, it did not come from desperation. It came from calculation. The German pilots heard the first warning on the radio, not as panic, but as confusion. A sudden change in tone, a call that did not fit the rhythm of the engagement. The lone escort was no longer passive. It was accelerating. Speed collapsed distance faster than voices could react. The German fighters were transitioning, climbing, regrouping, reorienting when the attack began. Their energy states were uneven, their attention divided, their radios filled with overlapping calls as each pilot tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they expected. This was the second failure. Coordination depends on shared interpretation. When interpretation fractures, coordination lags. The American pilot's approach did not fit the script. He did not engage in a turning fight. He did not commit to a prolonged chase. He struck and passed through, carrying excess speed that denied immediate retaliation. The Germans reacted individually instead of collectively. This was subtle, but decisive. A system built on anticipation relies on predictability. Once predictability dissolves, response time increases. Pilots begin to make local decisions rather than systemic ones. Radios grow louder. Instructions become reactive rather than directive. The collapse did not happen all at once. It happened in fragments. A pilot broke formation early. Another climbed too aggressively. A third fixated on the wrong target. None of these errors were catastrophic alone. Together, they disrupted the geometry of the fight. The American pilot exploited none of this consciously. He did not need to. He simply continued to behave in ways the system had not prepared for: maintaining speed, refusing fixation, disengaging before being drawn into symmetrical combat. From the German perspective, the problem was not skill, it was uncertainty. They could not determine intent. They could not predict movement, not synchronize response. And without synchronization, numerical advantage lost meaning. The radios reflected this shift. Calm gave way to urgency. Calls overlapped, commands shortened. Pilots began reporting position instead of receiving instruction. Control decentralized. This was the moment described later as collapse, not because aircraft were destroyed, but because understanding was. The sky had not become more dangerous, it had become unreadable. And when a combat system can no longer read the sky, it can no longer control it. That realization arrived too late. Combat, speed is often misunderstood. It is not aggression. It is not courage. It is not recklessness. Speed is control. Control over distance, control over timing, control over whether a fight continues or ends. The German pilots knew this as well as anyone. Their aircraft were fast, heavily armed, and lethal in the hands of veterans. But speed only matters when it is synchronized. When each pilot understands not only where he is, but where everyone else will be in the next few seconds. That synchronization was already weakening. The American pilot did not try to dominate the sky. He did not attempt to turn superiority into annihilation. Instead, he used speed to deny the Germans the one thing their system required: time. Each pass was brief. Each engagement incomplete. Each separation intentional. This was not the behavior German doctrine was built to counter. Luftwaffe tactics assumed commitment. An attacker dove, fired, turned, and stayed to fight. That pattern allowed defenders to anticipate recovery arcs, predict energy loss, and position for counterattack. Even superior speed could be neutralized if the faster aircraft lingered. The American pilot did not linger. He entered the engagement already planning the exit. This forced German pilots into a reactive posture. Instead of executing pre-planned maneuvers, they chased snapshots, brief windows where the enemy appeared and vanished. Radios filled with calls describing fleeting positions, outdated almost as soon as they were spoken. Speed compressed decision cycles. By the time one German pilot warned another, the geometry had already changed. A threat identified seconds earlier no longer existed in the same place. Instructions lagged reality. Control slipped, not because of chaos, but because of acceleration. The faster the fight moved, the less doctrine mattered. At high speed, fine motor control deteriorates. Vision narrows. G-forces strain the body. Even experienced pilots begin to prioritize immediate survival over abstract coordination. The American pilots' refusal to slow the engagement forced the Germans into this physiological trap. They could not settle the fight into a manageable rhythm. Attempts to slow the engagement failed. Diving to extend distance only created separation. Climbing to regain altitude advantage bled speed. Turning to force a merge exposed flanks. Every option carried risk, and none produced certainty. Speed turned options into liabilities. This was when radio discipline truly fractured. Instead of clear commands, pilots reported impressions. Instead of shared intent, they described individual threats. The network that once coordinated action now transmitted confusion. Each transmission added noise rather than clarity. The system had lost its tempo. The American pilot maintained his. He used speed not to pursue, but to reset, to re-enter the fight on his terms, to choose when to engage and when to disengage. This rhythm: strike, pass, separate, prevented the Germans from ever achieving closure. They could not finish the fight. More importantly, they could not predict it. In German fighter doctrine, predictability was a weapon. Pilots trained to exploit fear-induced behavior. They anticipated dives, climbs, and panic turns. When those behaviors did not appear, anticipation became liability. Speed exposed that vulnerability. It stripped away the advantage of experience by denying time to apply it. Veteran pilots could not leverage years of instinct when instinct was always one step behind reality. Skill requires context. Speed erased context before it could be processed. This was not domination. It was denial. The American pilot denied the Germans the stable conditions their system required. He denied them formation coherence. He denied them synchronized attack windows. He denied them the psychological comfort of understanding the fight. From the ground, this would later be described as collapse. From the cockpit, it felt like something else. It felt like control slipping through the fingers. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The Germans still had numbers. They still had capable aircraft. They still had experienced pilots. What they lacked was certainty. And in air combat, certainty is more valuable than firepower. The American pilot never needed to overwhelm his opponents. He needed to remain unpredictable long enough for the system opposing him to lose coherence. Once that happened, the outcome was no longer dictated by doctrine. It was dictated by momentum. Momentum favors those who can decide faster. Speed gave him that advantage, not because it made him fearless, but because it gave him control. And as the German radios filled with overlapping calls, corrections, and aborted instructions, one truth became unavoidable. The engagement was no longer theirs to manage. The system had not been defeated. It had been outpaced. In most combat narratives, disengagement is framed as defeat. In reality, it is often the most rational decision a system can make. The German pilots did not withdraw because they were beaten in a duel. They withdrew because the conditions that justified continuing the fight no longer existed. Luftwaffe doctrine was clear about priorities. Fighters were not sent aloft to chase escorts. Their mission was to destroy bombers. Escorts were obstacles, not objectives. Engaging them was acceptable only insofar as it enabled access to the bomber stream. This distinction mattered. As long as escorts could be pulled out of position, the system worked. Bombers became exposed. Flak and follow-on attacks finished the job. Losses were exchanged, but the mission retained coherence. But that coherence depended on escorts behaving predictably. The lone American pilot disrupted that calculus. Instead of being drawn away, he remained near the bombers. Instead of chasing, he intercepted. Instead of committing to prolonged engagements, he forced brief, costly choices. Every attempt to remove him from the equation consumed time and fuel without producing results. From a system perspective, this was inefficiency. Fuel mattered. German fighters operated with limited endurance. Extended maneuvering at high power settings burned reserves quickly. Ammunition mattered. Cannon shells expended against an escort were shells not available for bombers. Aircraft damage, even minor, risked losing experienced pilots who were increasingly difficult to replace. Commanders monitored these variables constantly. As the engagement dragged on without resolution, the equation shifted. The cost of continuing to engage the escort began to outweigh the potential benefit. Meanwhile, the bomber stream moved inexorably forward. Targets were passing beyond optimal interception points. Time was being lost. This is where doctrine asserted itself, not in attack, but in withdrawal. German pilots were trained to recognize when a fight no longer served the mission. Pride was subordinate to purpose. If escorts could not be neutralized efficiently, the correct response was to disengage, regroup, and preserve strength for future sorties. This decision was not cowardice. It was calculation. The radios reflected this shift. Calls changed in tone. Instead of reporting enemy positions, pilots reported fuel states. Instead of coordinating attacks, they acknowledged break-offs. Instructions simplified. The objective narrowed from engagement to extraction. From the outside, this appeared as collapse. From within the system, it was damage control. But damage control is still a form of failure. The Germans had not anticipated needing it against a lone escort. Their models did not account for an isolated pilot who could not be pulled away, outpaced, or forced into predictable error. The decision to disengage acknowledged a truth doctrine had not prepared them to face. The escort had become the fixed point. As German fighters peeled away, the bomber stream continued. The escorts elsewhere were still engaged, scattered across miles of sky. Losses were being taken on all sides. But in this sector, the system had yielded, not because it lacked capability, but because it lacked a solution. This moment mattered beyond the immediate engagement. Every aborted attack had cumulative effect. Bombers that survived delivered payloads, rail yards burned, factories slowed, fuel depots vanished. Attrition compounded not only in the air, but on the ground. The air war was an equation of accumulation, and every failed interception shifted the balance. German planners understood this. They tracked sortie outcomes meticulously. They counted bombers destroyed and bombers that escaped. They adjusted tactics based on results. But adjustment requires understanding. What failed here was not a maneuver. It was an assumption. The system assumed that isolation equaled vulnerability. When that assumption proved unreliable, the system lacked a fallback. There was no immediate doctrinal answer for an escort that could not be forced into error. Disengagement became the only rational option. This choice preserved pilots and aircraft, but it conceded space. It allowed bombers to pass unmolested through a sector that had been expected to yield results. It exposed a gap not in firepower, but in expectation. War systems tolerate losses, not tolerate unpredictability. The withdrawal acknowledged that unpredictability had entered the equation. From that point forward, the engagement no longer belonged to German doctrine. It belonged to circumstance. And circumstance, once freed from expectation, is impossible to command. The system had done what it was designed to do: evaluate cost, assess risk, and disengage when necessary. But in doing so, it revealed a vulnerability no amount of experience could conceal. A system optimized for probability had encountered an outlier, and probability had no answer. Engagement ended. Nothing about the sky suggested victory. There was no clear boundary between danger and safety, no moment when tension dissolved into relief. The radios quieted, but silence did not mean security. It meant uncertainty, the kind that lingers after adrenaline fades and calculation gives way to reflection. For the lone pilot, survival did not feel like success. It felt like aftermath. High-speed combat extracts payment even when nothing is lost. G-forces strain the body. Oxygen debt clouds the mind. Fine motor control returns slowly. Pilots often realized how close they had come to disaster only after the fight was over, when hands began to shake and the cockpit grew too quiet. This physiological toll was well known. What was less acknowledged was the psychological one. Not panicking carried its own burden. A pilot who panicked could later explain his actions as fear. A pilot who remained calm had no such defense. Every decision made under control was fully owned. Every outcome, good or bad, was carried forward without the relief of excuse. The American pilot had acted deliberately. He had chosen to stay. He had chosen when to engage and when to disengage. Those choices saved lives. They also created memory. War rewards decisiveness, but it does not insulate decision-makers from consequence. The clarity required to operate under pressure often sharpened awareness rather than dulling it. Pilots who remained calm remembered details. Others forgot. Angles, distances, moments of hesitation. Those memories did not fade easily. This was the hidden cost of competence. On the German side, the cost took a different form. The aborted engagement required explanation. Reports were written, timelines reconstructed, pilots debriefed. Commanders examined fuel usage, ammunition expenditure, and mission outcomes. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Doctrine had functioned as designed, and yet the result had been unsatisfactory. That discrepancy mattered. Military systems depend on confidence in their assumptions. When outcomes diverge from expectation, trust erodes not dramatically, but incrementally. Pilots begin to question instructions. Commanders hesitate before issuing them. Small delays appear in decision chains that once moved smoothly. This erosion rarely announces itself. It accumulates. German fighter units in 1944 were already under strain. Losses mounted. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less preparation. Fuel shortages limited training. The margin for error narrowed daily. In that environment, doctrinal certainty was not a luxury, it was a necessity. An encounter that undermined that certainty carried disproportionate weight. The question was not whether the lone escort had been skilled. The question was whether he represented a category. If one isolated pilot could behave unpredictably, others might as well. If unpredictability increased, interception models lost reliability. Planning became reactive instead of proactive. That shift was dangerous. On the Allied side, no one framed the event as a triumph of psychology or doctrine. It was logged as a successful escort engagement. Bombers had passed through a contested sector with acceptable losses. The system moved on. War rarely pauses to examine its own anomalies. But anomalies matter. They are the points where reality diverges from expectation, where systems reveal assumptions they did not know they were making, where future outcomes quietly begin to change. For the pilot, the cost of not panicking extended beyond the mission. It followed him into subsequent flights. Each engagement reinforced a standard he now felt compelled to meet. Calm became expectation. Control became obligation. There was no room to falter without confronting the contrast. This pressure was invisible to those around him. From the outside, he had performed as required. From within, the awareness of how close decisions came to irreversible outcomes sharpened. Success did not bring relief. It brought responsibility. This, too, was a form of attrition. Air wars are often described in terms of machines destroyed and pilots lost. Less attention is paid to the gradual exhaustion of those who survive, to the mental arithmetic performed in every cockpit, to the accumulation of moments where panic is suppressed at personal cost. By mid-1944, both sides were paying that price. Pilots flew knowing that certainty was slipping. Allied pilots flew knowing that survival depended on repeating near-impossible decisions under pressure. Neither side experienced clarity, only continuation. The engagement examined here did not end the air war. It did not transform strategy overnight. What it did was expose a truth often overlooked. Victory does not always announce itself as triumph. Sometimes it appears as endurance. The ability to remain calm did not make the pilot invulnerable. It made him accountable to himself, to the mission, to the consequences of every choice. That accountability lingered long after the radios fell silent. The system moved forward. The war continued. But something had shifted, not in the sky, in expectation. Wars are often explained through hardware: faster aircraft, better engines, superior firepower. These explanations are comfortable because they are measurable. They are also incomplete. What determined the outcome of this engagement was not age or bravery or even experience. It was the failure of a prediction. A system designed to exploit fear encountered an opponent who did not provide it. The German Air Force had built its tactical success on a reliable behavioral model. Isolation produced panic. Panic produced error. Error produced kills. This model held across years, theaters, and aircraft types. It was not superstition. It was pattern recognition validated by blood. That is what made it dangerous. When a belief works too consistently, it stops being questioned. It becomes invisible. Training reinforces it. Doctrine embeds it. Commanders plan around it without acknowledging it as an assumption. By 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer treated pilot behavior as a variable. It was treated as a constant. The engagement described earlier exposed the risk of that certainty. The American pilot did not introduce a new tactic. He did not rewrite the rules of air combat. He simply refused to behave in the way the system expected. That refusal forced the system to operate without its most reliable input. And without that input, the system hesitated. This is the lesson that mattered far beyond a single fight. Modern warfare is built on prediction. Sensors collect data. Analysts identify patterns. Commanders make decisions based on expected reactions. The more complex the system, the more it depends on assumptions about human behavior. When those assumptions hold, the system appears brilliant. When they fail, the system appears fragile. In 1944, The German Air Force was already under pressure. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and industrial disruption were eroding capacity. But erosion alone does not collapse a system. Systems fail when they can no longer anticipate outcomes. Unpredictability is corrosive. It forces hesitation. It complicates planning. It multiplies risk. From that point forward, every isolated escort could no longer be dismissed automatically. Every lone aircraft represented uncertainty. That uncertainty did not change tactics overnight, but it lingered. It required attention. It demanded contingency. It consumed cognitive bandwidth that could not be spared. The air war over Europe was not decided by individual encounters. It was decided by accumulation of sorties, of losses, of decisions made under pressure. Anything that increased friction within a system accelerated its decline. The refusal to panic was friction. On the Allied side, the lesson was quieter but equally important. Training emphasized discipline, formation, and procedure. Yet this engagement demonstrated that survival sometimes depended on something training could not fully instill: cognitive control under isolation. This was not recklessness. It was restraint. The ability to delay reaction, to resist instinct, to treat fear as data rather than command. That quality could not be mass-produced. It could not be guaranteed. It emerged unevenly, unpredictably, and often at great personal cost, which is why it mattered. History often celebrates youth as potential or experience as authority. War does not care about either. It tests decision-making under constraint. It punishes assumptions. It rewards adaptability, not consistency. The German pilots that day were not incompetent. They executed doctrine as trained. Their failure was systemic, not personal. They trusted a model that had served them well until it did not. The American pilot was not extraordinary because of his age. He was extraordinary because he did not resolve uncertainty in the expected way. He did not rush to escape uncertainty. He stayed within it long enough to deny the system clarity. That is a dangerous thing to do, not because it guarantees success, but because it exposes the truth. Most systems are more brittle than they appear. They rely not on perfection, but on compliance with expectation. Break that expectation, and strength becomes rigidity. This is why the story endures, not as a tale of youth defying odds, but as a reminder that wars are often decided not by superior force, but by flawed assumptions left unexamined for too long. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who is stronger, faster, or more experienced. It is the one who refuses to behave as predicted. Assumptions do not fail loudly. They erode quietly, one exception at a time. The engagement over Germany did not trigger an immediate doctrinal rewrite. No urgent memoranda were issued. No emergency conferences convened to address a lone escort behaving unexpectedly. On paper, the system still worked. Interceptions continued. Bombers were still shot down. Pilots still followed orders. But something had changed. From that moment on, certainty carried less weight. German commanders could no longer assume that isolation guaranteed vulnerability. They could no longer treat lone escorts as predictable problems with standardized solutions. Each deviation demanded attention, and attention was a resource already in short supply. This subtle shift mattered more than any single loss. War systems depend on simplification. They reduce complexity to manageable rules. If this happens, do that. These rules allow decisions to be made quickly, consistently, and at scale. When exceptions appear, systems adapt slowly. When exceptions multiply, systems hesitate. Hesitation is expensive. It lengthens response times. It increases fuel burn. It spreads formations thinner. It forces commanders to plan for scenarios that were once dismissed. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe could not afford inefficiency. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Training pipelines shortened. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer skills and less confidence. Veteran pilots carried increasing burdens. Every added uncertainty compounded existing strain. The air war was no longer about winning engagements. It was about surviving attrition. On the Allied side, the engagement passed without ceremony. Bombers returned. Damage was assessed. Reports filed. The system absorbed the outcome and moved forward. That asymmetry is important. One system was forced to reconsider its assumptions. The other simply continued. This is how wars are decided, not by dramatic reversals, but by differential strain. One side accumulates friction, the other accumulates momentum. The refusal to behave as expected created friction. It did not need to be repeated often. It did not need to be replicated perfectly. It only needed to exist. Once an assumption is exposed as conditional rather than absolute, it loses its power. Commanders must now ask questions they did not need to ask before. Pilots must now prepare for outcomes they were not trained to anticipate. Systems built for efficiency become systems burdened by caution. Caution slows war machines. The engagement also revealed a deeper truth. Adaptability is unevenly distributed. Not every pilot could do what this one did. Not every encounter would produce the same result. But systems that depend on uniform behavior are vulnerable to even rare deviations. The German Air Force did not lose the skies because it lacked courage or competence. It lost because the environment it operated in became less predictable, while its margin for error disappeared. That is the danger of unexamined certainty. In contrast, the Allied system did not require predictability from individuals. It relied on volume, redundancy, and momentum. One pilot behaving unexpectedly did not disrupt the system. It reinforced it. This imbalance grew over time. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe reflected this divergence. German fighters still rose to meet the bombers, but with diminishing coordination and increasing cost. Allied escorts ranged farther, stayed longer, and returned more often. The outcome was not sudden. It was cumulative. The moment examined here did not decide the war. It did not need to. It revealed how wars tip quietly, incrementally, through assumptions that stop holding under pressure. The lesson is not that youth triumphed over experience. It is that systems built on prediction eventually encounter reality. And reality does not always cooperate. What followed this engagement was not legend, but continuation. Missions flown, losses counted, pressure applied. The system that adapted survived. The one that relied on certainty did not. That is where this story truly ends. Not in the sky, but in the slow realization that expectation is not control. Want more documentaries that break down World War II beyond battles and biographies? Like the video, share it with someone who cares about history, and subscribe for the next case study.